Welcome to the Relationship Series podcast. My name is Ankush Jain, and each episode I'll be speaking to a different state of mind expert on the subject of relationships. Enjoy. Welcome to episode 17 of the Relationship Series. This week I'm interviewing Mark Jones. Mark Jones is a small business owner, yoga teacher, and he's the host of the internet radio show Ice Cream for the Soul. Welcome, Mark. Good to have you.
Hi, Ankush. Nice. I'm so pleased you invited me on here. So pleased. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we've been speaking for some time about having you on the show, and finally we managed to get our diaries to connect, and finally we get to talk, which is fantastic.
Yeah, everybody's so busy these days, and trying to hook up with people sometimes is quite difficult, isn't it?
Absolutely. So I know you're talking to us in sunny Spain, but
yeah.
I just thought, let's start off with just a bit of background in your own words as to where you've come from, what your experience has been, and how you come to be on this radio show, or this podcast, should I say, today.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think I said this to you briefly before we came on there. I really appreciate you doing this series of talks. I think it's very helpful for people. And it would have been very helpful for me as a younger man, well, even as a teenager as well. So perhaps that's where I'll start. I think we're going to talk about romantic relationships, and that was always I've always struggled with the male-female dynamics, and I'm sure many people can associate with that anyway. But I went through even as a young boy, I was very intrigued by the females, but I just didn't know where to start with them. And then puberty hit me, and that was also a bit of a nightmare when puberty kicked in. And I still was finding the female even more so intriguing than at the time of puberty, as many a teenage boy will know. And then finally, I jumped to my marriage, and it might sound like a stupid statement, because we all get attached to the person you marry. But I've seen now the problem with being too attached, and I've come across this word a lot in my yoga studies, and I never quite understood what that meant, really, because you say, how can you not be attached to somebody? But I think there's a danger in being leaning on somebody too much, and you kind of lose your own power. And there was quite a lot of neediness in that for me as well in the marriage. But there was also the aspect of, this is why I said I'm so pleased that you're doing this relationship thing. As a child, or as children, I'm sure children don't get much education around relationships even now. But I had no idea how to be in a relationship, and I only had my mother and father to gauge how a relationship should be. And they didn't have exactly a great relationship, they had quite a dysfunctional marriage. So, surprise, surprise, it wasn't, my marriage to my wife didn't last very long. It was a very short 2-year marriage, and on the divorce papers there was another person involved, another man was involved. That's why we got divorced. And at the time, now with hindsight, I was blaming it all on unfaithfulness, and I left me totally out of the picture altogether. And even now, it's over 20 years ago, and it can bring up some quite strong emotions about that period of my life. It was a very difficult time again, because that attachment, I can remember it, and it was a very painful time for me. But now I can see, in some ways, I can understand why what happened, because there was no real connection between, after the initial flourishing of the physical attraction with my ex-wife, once the marriage got underway, I'd always been told, for example, you had to work hard at relationships. Well, I had no real idea what that was in my innocence. So I was just working very hard to pay the bills, pay the mortgage, pay what needed to be doing, and consequently was neglecting my wife. And I'm not leaving her totally out of the blame for this. It's a two-way street. But I can see there was very little connection between us. There was very little connection, and I've realised that was part of my personality. I'm quite insular person, quite introverted. I'm quite happy in my own space. I'm quite happy not speaking too much. And people who hear me, who know me, might laugh at that, but that is very true. I'm quite happy to be on my own. And then sometimes I'd come on to my wife and just at the end of I'd only speak to her maybe 10 minutes out of the day and then wondered why she was off with me, you know. So this kind of pattern repeated then after my breakdown of my marriage with other girlfriends, and quite often they just fail, and I couldn't understand it. I kept blaming them all the time. It was never my fault. It was always their fault. And then finally I met my partner Sheila. So I've been with Sheila now for 11 years, and we had quite a rocky ride for the first few years. And luckily for me, Sheila's a lot more patient than some of my previous partners. I think she likes a challenge, Sheila. So she was more willing to. Men joke about this, but she was determined to mould me into the perfect man, I think. We all talk about, men often talk about, oh, the missus, she's always trying to change me, she's always trying to change me. So Sheila was giving me these personal development CDs or Tony Robbins, and I found some of that quite interesting. But on some level, the stuff hit on, but never actually resonated and got really deep down until I came across a state of mind understanding, an innate health understanding, and I was really, really impacted by this one particular guy talking. And he was talking about the nature of thought. And it was from that moment there was a big shift in the relationships with Sheila. And I can see now how my failings in previous relationships because of that insight. So, would you like me to go on?
No, I think you know we'll obviously talk more. I just found so much great stuff that we could talk about in just that initial piece, and thanks for sharing so openly and so honestly and vulnerably. I could really feel that. One thing that you said was how in previous relationships you were always blaming other people and leaving yourself out. And it really reminded me of, you know, full circle of the very first interview that I did was with a lady called Christine Livingston. And she was talking about her own experiences from a woman's point of view, saying,
right.
You know, as women, what do women bring to the relationship? And what's so interesting is from a man's point of view now, several episodes later, in the same conversation, you have the same insight about, well, what are we as men bringing to relationships? So I just found that very, very interesting. The other thing that I found really interesting was you said that the only education you had about relationships was from seeing your parents or the relationships that were in your own life. And that was really interesting because we all know that we all turn into our parents, or we joke about turning into our parents.
Yeah.
And those patterns seem to continue. And that was really kind of stark and just really hit me as you were talking. And how what's interesting now is that as relationships change, such as yours and the other speakers that we've spoken to and the people they work with, how that's now going to impact future generations because the role models they'll have are going to be totally different. So thank you for that. One thing I wanted to ask you about was we chatted beforehand and you were talking about how listening's really important. And I know that's something that is brought up a lot in the area of relationships. So could you just say some more about listening?
Yeah, because in that same I got very interested. I was hearing that particular man talk, and like I said, I was really impacted deeply. And I could talk for an hour or 2 hours about that, and maybe people wouldn't be impacted. They've only got such a short time, so I won't talk about why and what when. But I was impacted and saw he was talking about how we're only ever feeling our own thinking. And I really saw the truth of that in the moment. And I will just say this, I think I said to you, I took the breakup of my marriage quite hard. And I was feeling sorry for myself for about a good 2 years, maybe. And then when this man was talking about thought, I realised that I really, at the time, I really did think it was the situation that was creating all this pain and this depression in me. Whereas once I saw the true nature of thought, and that thought is what creates the feeling, I realised that I'd literally been banging myself over the head with like an hammer, because I'd been replaying the situation over and over and over again in my mind, what had happened. I just really wanted to get that, because many people don't see that, and I think if people really grasp that about thought, that can be very helpful. But going back to the listening, I think after I was impacted by what this man was saying, his name was Dr. George Pansky, I was really drawn to learn more about what he was talking about. So I went on quite a few courses, and I ended up with a man he's actually a cousin of George Pansky. He's ended up with Jack Pansky. And he was talking a lot about when you're with people, and it's not necessarily just a romantic part in a partnership, it's even with your children or a family member or a work colleague or anything. He said, if you want to connect with somebody, really listen to them. And I was like, okay, yeah, no problem. And he had us doing this listening exercise, and then he questioned us afterwards about how much we'd heard. And then he really pointed out to us that most of the people who were doing the exercise, there was a group of us, were kind of listening to people, but listening through the filter of their own thinking about what the person was saying to them. So in many ways, I was only perhaps 50% of my attention was with that person. And I realised that that's how I was spending most of my time when connecting with people. I was half listening to them and half listening about what I thought they were saying and my interpretation of what they were saying, and how I could help them or how I could advise them or whatever the situation was. And he then asked us to do the same exercise again, but you can't necessarily stop all that inner thinking, but there is an ability to just kind of leave it to one side. You can ignore it. So, and in a consequence, you become really present with the person who's opposite you. And that is one of the most beautiful gifts you can give a person. And I don't care if it's your wife or your husband or your children or a friend. And automatically it's just a gift that people can really feel. And that might sound a bit flowery, but I think if we look back into our own relationships, the moments and perhaps memories that we have of loved ones, we can quite often find that it wasn't necessarily things that we were doing, but it's the feeling you got from somebody when you was with them. I for example, had a beautiful relationship with my grandmother. I just adored my late grandmother. And now, looking from this understanding now, I can see she was totally with me 99% of the time, as grandmothers quite often are with their grandchildren. And it was almost as if she was hanging on my every word. She didn't want anything from me. She was just happy being with me. And there's such a space for, this might sound a bit cheesy to somebody, and I probably would have thought this myself a few years ago, but in that space, it's like a pure love arises when you let go of all that thinking between two people. So, having said that, then it makes sense if people really see that, and I've seen it for myself. When you give that presence to somebody, it gives a space for love and connection, and that's one of the greatest things I would say to anybody. One of the simplest things you can do in relationships is really listen to somebody. Not listen to what you think they're trying to say, not listen to how you can help them necessarily in that moment, but really just be with them, really listen to them, and ignore everything that's coming into your mind about the interpretations of that.
Yeah, and as you were speaking, I know we're talking on this episode specifically about romantic relationships.
Mm.
But that applies, I guess, across all relationships, doesn't it?
Yeah, totally. The romantic relationships are relevant to me because of the struggles I've had with them. I've got two sons, and unfortunately, my sons, before I came across this understanding, my sons had grown up and left home. So I wish I'd had this understanding when they were children, because I would have been a much better father. I would have been a much better father than I was. So it's across the board. It's across the board.
Yeah. So you talked about listening. In addition to listening, is there any other practical advice you'd give to people who are either looking for a new relationship or perhaps want to improve the relationship that they're in?
Yes. And well, I'll just tell you something that I heard today that really impacted me. And I was listening to he was a spiritual teacher, and that doesn't put some people off. He was a very wise man, this man, and he was talking about a time when a woman had come to see him, and she was telling him about how she'd found the perfect man. She'd finally found love for this man, and he was going, he's so wonderful. I love him so much. I love him so much. I love him so much. All this kind of, which is beautiful, of course. But then he said, and I brought a few notes because I wanted to say this right. I wanted to do it justice. He said, he asked her. He said, "Now, where is that love coming from?" He said, "Is he pushing that love inside you? Is he cramming that love inside you?" I said, or is that love arising in you? He said this to the woman, and she reflected for a moment. She goes, "No, you're right. It's rising in me, this love." And he said, "Well, you take responsibility for that love. Don't. You can take the responsibility and set this man free of any responsibility, and in that way, then you can just share the love that you have. You're not projecting it. It's not coming. You're not believing it's because of him." And I think that's important with partners. It's not leaning on the other person or seeing that thinking that the love's coming from them. Of course, that love arises in you, and it's like you take ownership for that. I don't know if that makes sense to anybody, but you take ownership for that, and then you share it with that other person. And I think that's a good bit of advice. Take responsibility for that love that's within you, and then direct it out in whichever way you can, in a beautiful way. And I think we've already touched on this. I think. Well, there's one more point of practical advice I'd like to give, and I think that's if you're single and you're really feeling a bit frustrated, or you really think you want a relationship, and I think it's one thing that I found is that I can really see this is true for myself. Before I met Sheila, I suddenly became very content with being alone. And previously, I'd always been on the hunt in many ways, putting my well-being on having a partner. And it was strange in many ways that I finally let go of all those ideas, and that's when I met Sheila. So I think it's really finding, in whichever way you can, finding your own self-love. And I don't think that, some people think, well, that's selfish, but I don't believe that's true at all. If you can't love yourself, how can you love somebody else? How can you take ownership for that? If you can't take ownership for your love of yourself, how can you share that with somebody else, love with somebody else? And going back again, I would say to anybody that listening thing, it's such a simple thing you can do, and I think that's a great thing you can do in relationships. I know we're talking about romantic relationships, but you'll find if you just do that, it will help you across the board in any relationship.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark. I love what you said about taking ownership of love, and I guess what occurs to me is that this is one of the misunderstandings that you and all the other people I've spoken to point to and talk about, that if we see that our feelings of love or unhappiness, any of them are coming from the other person, then it's going to be really important to make sure that the other person is doing what we think they should be doing.
Exactly, yeah.
or that they're the wrong person. And what I heard was, don't put that on them to make you happy. And if you do that, if you take that pressure off them, if you take ownership of it, then you'll be much better off.
And it also works the other way. I think this is very important. It also works the other way if you have those moments, which invariably happen in relationships. It's impossible to expect perfect, smooth running relationship all the time between a couple. It's like expecting it to always to be sunny. It's just, there's natural ups and downs. We all have our moods, but also now I've learned more and more to take responsibility for my own frustrations and my own angers. If Sheila and I have a little a fallout, and invariably when I do that, and only one person has to have an understanding of this. I'm very lucky that Sheila has got an understanding of this as well. So in our household now, we still have our little occasional arguments, but they don't go on. There's not them stormy silences for days on end like I've had in previous relationships, or even had at the beginning of this relationship. Sheila, we learn to take responsibility for our own anger as well. So it works both ways. It's not just the love, it's the anger as well, or frustrations or whatever is arising. And as soon as you do that, and you see that, it really is only coming from within you, it makes no sense to keep hold of it. It's literally like, I've heard people using this in this innate health thing that we're talking about. It's like literally like strangling yourself. And once you really see that you're doing that to yourself, it's just totally illogical to let go. So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
What would you say to someone who says, well, if I don't put any of that on the other person, if it's all from me, won't that make me a doormat? Won't that make me get walked over by the other person? What would you say to someone like that?
No, because I think what happens is you find in those moments, I'm talking from my own experience now, and I'm still learning. If Sheila was telling you, maybe Sheila and I will come on, she'll tell a totally different story one day if we came on together. But I think she'll tell you when you find this understanding with yourself, it brings you to a place of real clarity. So you're not talking to somebody through anger. For example, in a problem in the relationship, you realise the anger is arising. So it doesn't necessarily always happen this way. It doesn't necessarily mean that as soon as you recognise it, you're going to stop being angry. But quite often now, if that happens with Sheila and I, and she'll say, "Oh, let's talk," and I'll say, "Well, if I'm still annoyed and it's not dissipating, I'll say, well, do you mind if we talk later?" So just little things like that, and it brings a clarity to a person. So the doormat thing doesn't arise because you're speaking from wisdom. You've got this innate wisdom, so you're not going to be pulled into like a doormat kind of relationship it just gives you. And if you did, then and you couldn't resolve that, then there'd come a point where you might really see that this relationship isn't right for you. Because I think it's worth saying that just because you get this understanding, it doesn't mean that all relationships are going to work. You might come to a place of wisdom where you think, well, this person and I just aren't right for each other. So I think there comes, your wisdom will tell you that if that's true. Did that make sense? I felt like I was waffling a bit there, Ankush.
No, by wisdom, is that the same thing as intuition and gut feeling?
Yeah, I would say that all those are very much joined. And again, I think if people a lot in the recent years have been talking about presence and coming into the now, but I think when people really do come into their moments, that's when they've got more chance of connecting with their intuition and the gut feelings. Whereas quite often we're so in our heads, we miss all those little signals that we're getting from ourselves.
So keeping in mind what you've said, what would you say to people? Because I remember reading this years ago about you need to set tough personal boundaries in relationships, especially at the start, so that you don't get walked over and people know where your boundaries are. Do you think that's still necessary coming from this understanding?
I think that's commonsensical, to be honest. If, for example, if you're a skydiver and you really want a partner who wants to go skydiving with you, and then you don't tell them until 6 months into a relationship, and the person's afraid of heights, then you're going to have problems, you know. So I think there's certain commonsensical things to. I'm not a great lover of making lists and this and the other. And Sheila said this once, and she jokes about it to me. She said she actually made a list of things she wanted in an ideal partner, and then she said one of the things was a sense of humour. And she said afterwards she said I ticked most of the boxes apart from sense of humour. And I said, what are you talking about? I've got a great sense of humour. And many of my friends and other friends of us both will say, yeah, he's got a good sense of humour, but it's not her sense of humour. So I think it's good to have those little things in mind, because sometimes people get into relationships, especially with the physical attraction can be very, very strong initially. And there might be quite a few other factors that are there, but then 6 months down the line or 2 years down the line or whenever, you suddenly realise that besides the physical, you've got nothing in common, and they can become issues, then it can become problems. So I think there's nothing wrong with that, with creating boundaries and talking about what you like and what's good for you, etc. I think there's nothing wrong with that.
Do you have any particular books that impacted you that you'd recommend? I know there's one that I've recently been reading by George Pransky, who you mentioned earlier on.
Are you talking about the Relationship Handbook?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, well, he's written that a few years ago, but I think he'd still say there's a lot of good stuff in that book. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in that book. And I would say I read so much. It's funny, I've not read much on relationships for a long time. That's because my relationship's so perfect now. But I think that's a good one I think that if you just read that one book, and again, he's the man who impacted me very profoundly initially. So I would say, even if you just take a look at that book, I would agree with you on that one. If I think of any more, I'll tell you afterwards, and perhaps you could send it out to your list or whatever, Ankush.
Okay.
Right now, there's none coming to me at the top of my head.
No problem. And I guess we're just kind of coming to a close now. But is there anything that what is the one thing that you'd like people to take away from this interview, from this conversation with you in regards to their own relationships?
Listening. I know it's not sexy. It doesn't sound sexy initially, but even now, I've struggled with myself a lot with this particular thing. And even when Jack Pransky first suggested doing the listening exercises, I've never been keen on the exercises. It always reminded me of school, and I was never academic at school. But the more I listen and listen from that space, it really does seem that the more beautiful relationships can be. And I still forget that all the time. For me, it's not a natural thing. I'm quite in my head quite often, and Sheila will tell you this. I'm in my own little world quite often. But the times when I come out of that and I connect with Sheila, are the most beautiful times that we have together.
Great. Well, if people want to get in contact with you or they want to find out about your radio show, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, they can. If anybody wants to contact me, they can contact me at icecreamforthesoul@hotmail.com. And the 4 is the number 4. And I do the radio shows usually once a week. Like I say, it's kind of a hobby of mine. So the website for that is www.icecreamforthesoul.com.
Brilliant.
And I'm always on Facebook under Yoga Mark. If you look for Yoga Mark, people find me on there. Brilliant.
And if people want to get hold of any of the other interviews in this series, they can do so via my website, which is www.ankushjain.co.uk. You can find me on Twitter at AnkushKJain and on Facebook, which is facebook.com/AnkushJainLTD. Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure. And everyone else, I'll speak to you next time.
Thank you very much, Ankush. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Me too. Take care. This was the Relationship Series podcast. If you like this episode, please share it and leave us your feedback online. Thanks for listening.